Thank you, Senator Lyons. Just to be clear, the Urban Land Institute, if you're not familiar with it, is a 70-plus-year-old organization, nonprofit, run mostly by volunteers. We have some 30,000 members, mostly in the U.S., but around the world, who are in all aspects of the real estate industry, largely driven by the for-profit private real estate industry. I like to think of them as the white hats in the real estate industry, although I know many people may think that's an oxymoron. But we also have nonprofits and academics, local government officials, all sorts. And I've had the privilege to be the senior fellow there for the last 13 years, focused both on housing and now increasingly on urban resilience, and had the opportunity to work on the advisory panel that we did for the New York, New Jersey region. For over 40 years, ULI has been holding these advisory panels. I will tell you a little bit about the process because it's very comprehensive, and one of, let's see if I can figure out how to work the technology here. If I go forward, yes. So what we did here was to come in, as you see, 9 months after Sandy, and to take a look not at the issues of immediate rebuilding, but rather the long-term implications of a changing climate, and how does a region like New York, New Jersey, plan for a radically changing climate, but one in which it will be changing in ways that are unpredictable. We've actually had we're going to have the opportunity to do 6 more of these advisory panels, thanks to a grant that we received from the Kresge Foundation following the release of our report of this advisory panel. So we looked at the long-term resilience, and by that what we're really talking about is decades long, not next year, not the end, not 2020, but an evolution of land use patterns and development over the course of the next several decades. It was funded by our own foundation. We brought in 25 experts, both from the region itself and from around the country. This is the way our advisory panels are run, by volunteer members. We fly them in, we pay for them to come in, we give them a nice hotel, we give them good food, we make sure they have plenty of wine so that their minds are flexible and creative. But they donate a week of their time. And we had private developers, we had academics, we had people from finance, insurance, really a wide spectrum of people who came in for those 6 days in New York City. What we did, we started off by reviewing all the reports that had been issued before. We had the exceptional opportunity to review the SIR report that Jamie was talking about. It came out just before we got convened, and so we had the benefit of their work too. I'm a New Yorker, so I can say quite boldly that I think it's the best report that any city has done in terms of looking forward and rebuilding. Unfortunately, it was prompted by one of the worst events in the country, but it was a fine piece of work. We then sent out our team into different small groups, and they toured Long Island, they toured the Rockaways, they toured all of the New York City boroughs, and they did the Jersey coastline as well. They interviewed over 100 local leaders and came up with a series of, series of recommendations, 23 in all, and I'm only going to hit a few of them. The first one was very clear and unequivocal that climate change is real and it's here to stay. We did not get into why it's here. We simply acknowledge the fact that it is here. This may seem unexciting and unprovocative in a room like this, but you need to understand that amongst our 30,000 members, there are those who do not believe in either sea level rise or climate change. So for the Institute to come out with a statement like this was actually a very strong statement that the real estate industry is getting on board the program. We recommended that the Sandy Task Force, the federal Sandy Task Force, be reconstituted or something like that be created at the federal level. One of the things that this task force has been able to do has been to bring together all of the various federal silos to start talking to each other. It certainly hasn't eliminated the red tape. It certainly hasn't made the process that much more flexible. But the mere fact that you had one place to talk to the federal government was a very major step forward. So we would recommend that this kind of task force be established actually on an ongoing basis, not just for this reason, but actually on a national basis in some form, and that it would include, if it was on a regional basis, for instance, it would include the governors of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. It might include the mayor of New York City. So there's a way to link both the local government, state government, and the federal government into a place where they can all talk together. One of the next things was to talk about the way in which we design infrastructure. And we talked about it, actually, the talks so far this morning have pointed to this, that infrastructure needs to do more than simply protect. As we design to rebuild or protect different areas, and one of the greatest examples actually came right out of the SIR report, which is the Seaport City, which would be a Battery Park-like city created on the eastern side of Lower Manhattan, just as Battery Park is created on the west side of Manhattan. And it would be, actually we did some preliminary analysis with some of our real estate developers in New York City at the request of SIR before the SIR report came out. And this was a back of the envelope calculation depending upon where markets are, but given the high market values, land values in New York City, by and large we figured out that if you created that land, you could lease it and recover the cost of creating that land from the development that you would put on top of that, both residential and commercial and otherwise. Now, that doesn't answer the host of other questions that need to be answered in terms of environmental, water flows, and all the like that have to be done, connectivity, etc. But the basic concept is this would be a protective infrastructure that it could actually pay for itself. There are actually many other smaller examples of that that you can conceive of as you go forward. Regional planning, particularly when you're taking a look at a region like New York and New Jersey, becomes essential. The fact that the transportation systems, for example, follow political lines makes absolutely no sense from a planning point of view. So you've got the Port Authority of New York, yes, but they don't, the Metropolitan Transit Authority is a state-run agency, and that controls the subways and the trains in New York. Even so, Metro North, Long Island Railroad officials don't necessarily talk to each other, and none of them necessarily talk to the PATH, which takes the trains over into New Jersey or into Jersey Transit. So all of these have to be talking together. How do you create that kind of regional vision? We did not necessarily recommend a particular new agency like the Port Authority, but there are a lot of ways you can imagine where a regional planning concept could be put together that would actually have teeth and actually be able to make a difference in terms of what local plans actually were. Part of this is a vision. What do you want to have your region to look like? What would the people, the leadership of the New York, New Jersey region like to have their region be in 2050 in terms of its ability to respond to a growing number of increasingly severe storms and a rising sea level? Without that vision, it's very hard to do long-term planning. And what we're talking about here is clearly 30, 40-year planning because that's how long it's going to take to do the kind of evolutionary land changes that are going to be required. One of the things we spent a lot of time on, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is how do you prioritize projects? Once you have created a vision, and we could sit around here and just come up with a very quick vision, we could then come up with a very quick back-of-the-envelope price to create that vision, and I would bet you dollars to donuts that we wouldn't have anywhere near the money to do that, to actually achieve that vision. We're talking about tens and twenties and hundreds of billions of dollars ultimately to do the kind of rebuild and redesign of the New York, New Jersey region that would really be necessary over time to make it fully resilient. So since there isn't that kind of money now, nor is there likely to be all at once, the question is which projects do you start with? And that's something that where you really have to start doing a cost-benefit analysis from our point of view. What is the cost of the project? What is the value? What are the high-value projects that are going to be affordable at this point? And then how do you plan for those to be done today in a way that become the basis for future infrastructure growth and development rather than become seen as a mistake later on? Oh, we shouldn't have done that. We should have done this. How do you do this so it's an incremental growth as money comes together? One of the ways that we decided was important as a first step to this kind of regional analysis is to take a look at the different land topologies and different areas within the region. This is potentially very political, very controversial, but from an analytic point of view, it's quite essential. So you're going to have regions that where you want to put more public investment. And by the same token, you're going to have regions where you're going to want to put less public investment, because ultimately you are going to anticipate the desire to step back from certain parts of the coastline or certain low-lying areas. Now, I know our former mayor, now former mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, said New York City never steps back from the shoreline, and he wanted to push it right up to the edge. And in parts of New York City, that's actually quite doable and important to do. But there are also parts of New York City, and certainly parts of the region, where you could see over the next 20, 30 years a stepping back from areas like the Rockaways, areas like the Long Beach area on Long Island, parts of the New Jersey shoreline that simply do not make sense if your sea levels are rising and the storm surges are growing, to continue rebuilding and rebuilding, to continue pouring in more and more sand to build up the dunes. How do you do that? Politically very hard. Luckily, that wasn't our challenge. That's the challenge for the politicians. That's why you all get paid the big bucks to deal with that. But clearly, it's a gradual process. It's a generational process. It doesn't mean bussing people out right now, but it may mean that as properties turn over. It may mean that as properties turn over generationally, there is a slow rebuilding of the neighborhoods in a way that is planned in advance so that people can plan for it and anticipate it. Possible criteria, the criticality of need. You know, in one sense, if you take a look at Lower Manhattan, there's no reason why we should continue to build Lower Manhattan. It floods, it's down there. On the other hand, it is one of the most high-value parts of the country. And so, of course, we're going to rebuild there, and of course, we're going to hold on there. So it's criticality of need, market value to be protected. Also, potential market value to be created. There are places where, as you build, you can, in fact, increase the market value. You can anticipate that, and that will help offset the cost because of the greater real estate and other kinds of taxes that would be generated. And then there are obviously other kinds of performance criteria. You can't overlook the importance of culture, history, arts, health, safety, and welfare, all of the things that obviously folks up here in Boston understand very well, and even those of us in New York have a fairly good grasp of as well. Now, one of the things that we did talk about in terms of the creating the typologies was to think about different parts of the region. And by the way, I should just stop for a second and say, as we did this report, we clearly targeted at the New York, New Jersey region, but the intention is that it creates a framework for any region to take a look at their long-term resiliency planning. In fact, we're in the process of preparing a white paper which takes those 23 recommendations and makes them more generic so that they can be looked at from whether it's the Boston region, whether it's a region in California, or anywhere in the United States, or even globally, and applied. So we came up with, for the New York, New Jersey region, 4 different topologies. These aren't necessarily by any means cast in stone, but they're an example of how you might take a look at a region and think about it. One are the coastal transformation zones, which are high risk, think of Wall Street, but also very important to create resilience for and to hold on to in one fashion or another. Then there are the coastal transition zones that over time you would anticipate pulling back from lower density and a restructuring of the way the land is used. Then you have smart growth receiving zones. These would be the higher low-risk areas where you can increase the density. People who are moving out of the lower areas or the more high-risk areas that you don't intend to protect could be moved over to the these smart growth receiving areas connected by transportation, hardened infrastructure, etc. Again, as you can see, these kinds of changes are going to take a long time to implement, but you have to, in order to do that, start by planning and deciding where you want to have, which zones you have. Again, politically charged, perhaps, but essential to any kind of long-term resilience planning. And then an area that we call the coastal impact zones, I have to recognize that one of the things we talked about was the fact that there is going to be failures. They're going to be, the question is, are they going to be devastating failures, or can they be, quote, safe failures, where you know that infrastructure is going to go down for a period of time, but we'll come back within a reasonable period of time. The local community can plan for that ahead of time so that it can ride out that storm, rather than the kind of situation that happened in the New York, New Jersey area where it was chaos. And nobody anticipated whether the loss of the gasoline or the power outages. Everybody expects power outages, but for a day or so, but not for a week, as many of these areas or more than many of these areas were. So the question is, find out where your infrastructure, where it's not economically feasible to make that infrastructure so hardened that it will not fail under any circumstance. Say it will fail, but we will have plans to get it back up in a short period of time, 2 or 3 days, and you all need to plan for that, and then you can prepare in that fashion. By the way, just as an aside, and there'll be, I believe, more talk about this later this afternoon, one of the really scary things, if you think what happened in Sandy was really scary, particularly with the loss of life and the flooding and the inability to get gasoline, people being trapped like that, it's been explained to me, and I believe this is true, it may not be, but others are more expert than I am, that if the surge had hit, well, Hunts Point is up in the Bronx, and that's the central food distribution for not only New York City and the region, but all the way up to as far north as Albany. 70% of all food for that region goes through Hunts Point. And if the surge had hit at high tide, which was they're about an hour apart, there would have been another foot of flooding, and all of Hunts Point would have flooded. Some of those distribution down there, some of the meat packing, they have backups, and they could keep going for a while. But the vegetables, I was walking around there, the vegetable distribution section, no backup of any side. If it had flooded, it would have shut down. And you can imagine the social tensions that would be created by the inability to get food for a week or 10 days in a city the size of New York City. They were showing me around, they talked about how they have plans to bring guards in, bring police in, and man the walls around, man the fences around in order to protect themselves. I mean, it's a little scary, but food is actually even more vital than gasoline in terms of keeping people alive. In a city where you expect to go downstairs to the bodega, get a quart of milk at 3 in the morning if you happen to forget it, or call up and have food ordered in. We're not a rural state like Vermont. I spent a lot of time in Maine, and there people don't worry about things like that because they go down the cellar and they pull up, the vegetables that they put away from in the fall.
We just worry about people coming in from New York and Massachusetts.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure my neighbors aren't going to be too happy when I show up there. Can you cook me dinner, please? We talked a little bit about this earlier, this issue of financing and insurance. We came down very clearly in thinking that we've got to start pricing properties accurately based upon climate risk. This is something that the appraisal industry to date has not really done, and it's not easy to do. It's not going to be easy to do. It's also that we have to price financing in the same way. Again, not easy to do. This means that in some areas, the cost of financing should go up, and the cost of appraisal, the value of land should go down based upon a risk. Now, these risks are, the devil is more than in the details here, because how do you evaluate the likelihood of a piece of property being flooded again, given the uncertainty of the changes in the climates and the way these storms are happening episodically? But to begin to reflect the issues of climate change and vulnerability into the pricing of the real estate itself and into the pricing of the insurance is something that the bankers in our group were advocating for, that this is something they needed to start figuring out how to do. Actually, we have many members of our organization who own properties all over the world. And they are not yet, they're just beginning to think about how do they value their portfolio based on the susceptibility to climate change in different cities around the world and the location within that city and the preparations that that city has made to protect them and the preparations that they've made on that property and how to protect them. So it's a way of looking at real estate now that is going to evolve and change quite dramatically the way we think about valuing properties and pricing financing. Then we got into the issue of insurance, and that's been touched on already this morning. Very tough, but we made a very clear recommendation that the ultimate principle needs to be to price risk at full value, to fully reflect the risk. Without that, it's impossible for an active private insurance market to operate. If the federal government continues to subsidize, it does several things. It undermines the ability of a private insurance market to operate, so we don't have to rely fully on the National Flood Insurance Program. Number two, as was pointed out, it does provide a subsidy and incentive for people to move to higher risk, more vulnerable areas. Now, then we have the other side, as was pointed out, which is very simply that in many lower and moderate income communities, people have lived in those communities for a long time. And if you take their flood insurance premium from $600, say, up to $10,000, they can't afford that. And it means they are going to default on their mortgage if they have one, or that ultimately they're simply going to have to sell their home and move out. There are equity issues here that are critically important. So what we did was to suggest that there need to be mechanisms created to provide for the protection of lower and moderate income homeowners and store owners in these areas where the premiums need to rise. There are places, as we all can imagine, where on the coastline there are houses that are owned by people who are quite wealthy. They're their second homes or third homes. And quite frankly, to be very personal about this, I really don't want my tax dollars going to subsidize their flood insurance, and I doubt many of us do either. On the other hand, I'm quite happy to have it subsidized for a while in a lower or moderate income community, knowing that in time, that community is either going to reshape its land uses or rebuild in ways that will protect it, and therefore that the premiums can come down again to fully reflect the risk. Very difficult, very tricky. Long-term changes are needed, but this is clearly something. We're working with Lloyd's of London on a paper on this whole insurance issue, and that is one of the underlying principles that they have advocated for. Again, partly because there can be no private market if the federal government subsidizes flood insurance to a level that is unworkable for the private industry. By the way, there's another challenge here, again in the details. Insurance premiums have been now written based upon what's happened in the past. These are not really actuarial risks because there aren't enough examples to be truly actuarial. Our age, you can do it, they have a pretty good actuarial idea how much longer I'm going to live, how much longer, what my health is likely to be, because there are millions and millions of people like me around. But there's only this one piece of property. So that's not actuarial, so it's a very difficult engineering and judgment calculation about what the risk of damage and what the likelihood and the amount of damage is going to be. So it's normally done, well, what's happened over the last 10 years? Which ultimately now we're beginning to learn is irrelevant to what's going to happen for the next 10 years. So now the insurance industry is having to take a look at how do we project forward the likelihood in terms of setting insurance premiums. Not easy to do. So again, on the issue of finance, the question of financing all of this, the dollars we're talking about are billions of dollars for any region. We've got some billions of dollars coming in from the federal government. Thank you very much. We appreciate that, but at the same time, it's nowhere near enough. Not to do the fundamental kinds of changes over the long term that are going to be needed. The states, New Jersey, New York, any particular state doesn't have enough funding, nor do the municipalities. So the way in which this is going to have to be financed is going to require new kinds of funding mechanisms, perhaps regional funding mechanisms, perhaps partnerships with the federal government and a regional funding mechanism. There are plenty of ideas that can be done to use this, particularly where you're looking at building infrastructure that has value added in itself, like the seaport city. Not many examples are going to be that major, but to the extent that there is a value created at the same time that's building protection, there are ways that that could be financed through a regional mechanism. We began to see how, as we talked to local officials, the challenges at the local level in terms of responding to after the storm. A number of things happened, and I want to spend a few minutes just talking about these at the end here. First off, each federal agency still has its own requirements. You can do use these dollars for this purpose, and you can use those dollars for that purpose. And if you at the local level say, yeah, but what about this third purpose, or can we combine all of these dollars? The answer is no, I'm sorry, the regulations, or you have to get you have to appeal, et cetera, et cetera. Very cumbersome, understandable. I've worked at the federal level and I understand why the regulations are essential and why all of the checks and balances are critical, but it's very difficult at the local level to work with this. So we felt that we needed to find ways to increase the flexibility of the federal government's funding and to allow more local discretion on how dollars came in, so that they could be at the local level combined in different ways and perhaps used to lever private dollars, lever local dollars. And so more funding directly down to the localist level rather than coming through the states or the big cities or things like that. Get the money to the ground where it can be used most effectively and planned for most effectively. Now, that requires some things to go along with that, which I'll get to in a minute. But the first thing, one of the things that we've noticed too is that any local community that says, you're right, we need to pull back, we shouldn't rebuild here, is giving up real estate value and therefore giving up tax dollars. And as a way to help allow that kind of decision to be made more fairly, we felt that there should be mechanisms to replace some of those local dollars. To the extent that a community says, we're going to pull back, we're not going to rebuild there, we're going to lose those values, that land is going to be public land for use of the public, but it won't be taxable, then we're losing 10, 20, 30% of our tax value, or if the values of the properties go down, is there a statewide mechanism that allows us to replace those dollars, at least for a while, until we are able to reestablish our tax base? Additionally, talk about creating incentives for responsible rebuilding. This gets to both the point of the way that's been talked about of having insurance premiums and actually financing premiums adjusted based upon efforts to mitigate, so that it's not just as it is now, all or nothing. Your property either meets the federal flood insurance guidelines, you're out of the flood zone, and therefore you get a certain level of insurance premiums and a certain level of financing costs, or it's in the flood zone, and therefore you have to buy all of this insurance and your high cost of financing. But if you do start to rebuild your building in a way that protects it so that the amount of damage that occurs is reduced, if you do move your mechanicals up, if you do use the first floor, say, as a living room and everything, kitchens and everything else are on the second floor, that should be reflected in the cost of the insurance as well, even if it's not 100% reduction in that cost. So finally, talk about one of the things that needs to be done clearly at the local level amongst local officials, and obviously the state government can facilitate this and encourage this, is to update zoning and building codes to reflect these regional typologies. Each area that you identify as one for increased zoning, increased protection, obviously a new zoning, a comprehensive plan. The converse for areas where you think over time you're going to want to pull back from, you need to start thinking about how do you zone a place like that? How do you perhaps zone it in stages, in the sense that for the next 5 years or 10 years, the current zoning is in place. But on the event of the next major storm, here's what the next zoning overlay is going to look like, so that you know that in advance. The worst time to talk about zoning is right after a storm. Nobody has the energy, the time, or really the rationality, at the local level, they're all traumatized, to really think about that rationally. Everybody after every event wants to do one thing. They want to rebuild, just as it was. Even if you didn't like it before, I want it back the way it was. We saw this in New Orleans over and over again. So starting to develop what are the long-term stages for the zoning, building code typologies, and the like. Now, the problem with bringing all of the money down to the local level and trying to have as much flexibility at the local level as possible is that in many local communities, as you probably well know, there isn't the capacity to do this kind of planning. They simply don't have it. We interviewed mayors in one particular town. The mayor happened to run the local garage. He's not a person who's educated in planning. We got the mayor of Long Beach called us up and said, we would love to have ULI come in and help us. We said, great, we can be there next week. He said, no, not that fast. I have to go out and hire a planning official. I don't have any planning officials. So it's that lack of capacity at the local level that's a fundamental challenge. So one of the things that we are recommending is that there be ways in which, from federal money or state money, local capacity is built up, and that localities are financially incented to collaborate with their neighbors, so they don't develop this plan, this plan, this plan, and they're all inconsistent. They develop a region-wide plan. And it's fascinating. Again, Long Beach, Long Island, the town of Long Beach refused the Corps of Engineers' offer to rebuild its dunes. The towns on all sides from the rest of the island did accept that. And you can know what the result is, which is the town of Long Beach got severely flooded and the others didn't. So the idea of having, not requiring, but encouraging all of this to plan, the localities to plan together, requires some incentive and some encouragement frequently, because, you know, local communities don't always like the other local communities so much. You've been there too. Okay, so, and then finally, that's part of the local capacity for local decision making. We need to start to do exactly what you're doing here, for which I congratulate you, which is start to increase our knowledge base within the local government, within the state governments, but also within the professions. We need to start educating real estate professionals, architects, lawyers, and others, engineers, more about the impacts of climate change and ways in which to be creative in terms of creating long-term resilience, and then creating, again, the kinds of long-term collaboration that I've been talking about. Well, that was a quick run through a lot. Thank you very much, and I again congratulate you on your conference.
All right,
Happy to take questions.
thank you. So we have time for some questions. We have one right here. Is there a microphone? Okay. Right up front, Chris. Representative Ross, sorry. Multiple.
Two microphones. Okay. Is that on?
Yes.
Okay. I got a little worried about adding up the numbers as you were giving us all the things that you wanted us to do. If we're subsidizing the lower income properties, and we're also financing what is needed to provide for the retreat, and we're providing some tax revenues that are going to be offsetting the ones that are being lost. And by the way, I would think we've got some private individuals who have lost property values that might want to talk to us about that as well. Have you actually tried to quantify this on a case study basis to give us a scale of what we're looking at? I get it that we're going to have to try and you know, shrink down and take slices of this over an extended period of time, but I am a little bit daunted by the amount of what we're looking at here.
Well, that's good to hear, because it means you're beginning to see the size of the challenge. And the second thing I say is, we did a few back of the envelopes, but they're not, have no real reliability at all, but they all came down to the fact that it was more than anybody was going to have. And so very difficult decisions are going to have to be made. And that's why we said at the very beginning, we need to think about this in terms of cost-benefit analysis, just a classic kind of private market sector approach, but needs to be done by the public sector as well. Where are the most valuable pieces of property? What do we really have to protect? What are the neighborhoods and communities? Very difficult, because it means that we'll pick some and others don't quite get to the level of being a critical neighborhood. So how do you handle that politically? Not easily. But then the next question is, what is the cost to protect that? And is the cost to protect that equal to or greater than the value, or the value that you're protecting equal to or greater than that cost? Because there are going to be some high value places where you say that, you know, the cost of protecting that's just too much. We don't have the resources. We've got to use them someplace else. The worst thing that could happen, and it happens all too frequently, is we'll do a little bit here, we'll do a little bit there. You need some for your community. Well, here's a little bit, not enough, and here's where some over there, not enough. Very, very difficult decisions have to be made. The only softening of the harshness of that message that I can make is that this is going to take time. This is going to take decades. You can't simply pull back from communities today or tomorrow. It's just not going to happen. You know that. But the land, I would predict that the land uses and the topologies of building on the Rockaways and Long Beach, the South Shore of Long Island, and on the Jersey Shore in 2050 are going to be dramatically different. They will be much better if we plan proactively on an ongoing basis over the next 20, 30 years. However, even if we don't, they're going to change, only they'll be much more haphazard and damaging. So the answer to your question is it's the key question. It's a daunting prospect, but that's one of the reasons why Kresge asked us to continue doing these kinds of advisory panels with local governments, state government, city governments, and regions to help starting to face these issues. Because they're easy to avoid, because they're nothing that's happening. If you don't have a storm today, why worry about it? But those of you who obviously are willing to take a long-term look at what's happening need to have the support of really pulling together in partnership with the private sector to really face these tough questions.
Time for another question.
Hi, I am from Vermont, and we have a lot of small towns and villages in Vermont, sort of a compact settlement pattern where we have historic villages surrounded hopefully by working landscapes. And it's a type of land use development that we try to encourage. The downside is that many of our historic villages were built right next to rivers, and they're subject to a lot of flooding. So I wonder, have you done any studies or modeling for that type of land use development? And second, are you trying to place a value on sort of intangibles, things like the value of historic architecture, the value of compact settlement patterns, which we hope reduce greenhouse gas emissions because more people are walking to work, walking to school, walking to the grocery store, and that these are also the areas where we tend, at least in Vermont, to have most of our infrastructure investments in sewer?
First off, we haven't done it because it needs to be done on a local level. But it's exactly the kind of analysis you're talking about. The non-tangible, the intangibles are very important, and they have to be weighed at the local level. What is the history of that particular factory? I'm quite familiar with the kinds of towns and historic downtowns you're talking about, the old factories that are being converted into housing, things like that. We've learned that if you want to have a vital, economically vital as well as socially viable town, you need to cherish the history, and you need to remember the traditions, and you need to use some of these old buildings that are right by the river frequently. So the question there is, how do you protect that building? If that's one of those, or that part of the downtown, you do one of two things. I spent many years in Augusta, Maine. It's right on the Kennebec River, and downtown Augusta floods. It doesn't take a storm to flood. It just takes, heavy snow melt in the spring, and it all floods. So that's okay if you've designed your buildings to accept that flooding, and by moving everything up high enough and the like. So there are ways to design around these kinds of issues for the long term and to preserve that kind of history, which clearly is very, very important. So, but that has to be done at the local level. You can't do that from Washington. You can't do that even from Montpelier. You really have to do that in the town itself, which is why we say so much of the planning and the money and the expertise and the skill needs to be in the local community government itself. And if that requires some funding to hire an extra planners or to do some training and things like that, then that's what should happen.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay? Yes, sir.
Is there guidance in government intervention in getting insurance companies to settle the claims? In New Jersey, we have so many homeowners who still haven't settled their claims. We have wind blaming flood, flood blaming wind, and both of them sending the homeowner to FEMA. Should the government intervene and get them to negotiate in good faith?
That's actually not an issue that we addressed, quite frankly, because we were looking at the long-term planning, not the immediate recovery. We ran across lots of stories about that, clearly, even when we were doing this last summer. And now some of that's continuing on. It's what happened after Katrina as well. It happens at every one of these. And the government is, and this is not to defend the government, but they're caught in a hard place. Because moving too fast, as shocking as it may appear to you, there are people who will take advantage of this and try to defraud the federal government. And neither you nor I want to have a whole lot of our dollars go out to the wrong people. On the other hand, the difficulty is the government regulations now require for kinds of paperwork and other records that many people simply either never had, or if they had them, they were lost in the storm and not able to prove and redo. It's a constant challenge. And the tension between those is never done in a way that's satisfactory to anybody, as far as I know. I don't know who would intervene at that point to try to solve that. The federal government can do that, but the federal government is not very light on its foot, with all due respect to the federal government. They're almost, you're better off trying to bring in consumer advocate groups who are much more familiar with that and can, I think, be much better advocates. So, important question, but a tough one.